Hello prep2. In this term we are going to study David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. So let's In this video we are going to discuss the first 5 chapters. So let's start. Dickens was born in 1812. When he was 5 years old, he had to move with his family. He had a very hard childhood because of some of the economic problems that his family had. When he was 12 years old, he had to start working in a factory. After that, their life had improved as they received the inheritance of his grandma. We can see that there are great similarities between the life of Dickens and the life of David Copperfield, as we are going to see throughout the novel. The novel title is The Personal History of David Copperfield. It's like an autobiography of Dickens himself. It was released between 1848 and 1849. In this novel, Dickens criticized the system and the society in England at that time. The novel is considered as a classic novel. It's a family drama. It describes the life of David and how he grew from a boy to a man. Okay, we will find out about David's abusive stepfather, his friends, his unsuitable first marriage, about the other characters that we will meet in this novel, and so on. We'll start with a summary for the whole novel. The story is about the life of David Copperfield. David's father died 6 months before he was born. For this reason, he lives with his mother and his nanny, Begetty. 7 years later, his mother remarried a man called Edward Murdstone. This man was very cruel. He sent David to a school. Mr. Creakle, the owner of the school, was very strict. During the holidays, David visits his mother and learns that his mother has got a baby. When school starts again, his mother dies and he has to return home. Mr. Murdstone sends him to work in a London factory, but he goes to live with his aunt, and it's when he meets people like Agnes and Dora. David married Dora, but he dies very young. Few years later, he gets married to Agnes, the woman who he had 2 kids with. The main characters of the novel. David Copperfield, the hero and the narrator of the novel, the one who tells us his story. Clara Begetty, David's nurse. Miss Betsy Trotwood, David's great aunt. Mr. Edward Murdstone, David's stepfather. Miss Jane Murdstone, Mr. Murdstone's sister. We have also Mr. Daniel Begetty, Clara Begetty's brother. Ham, Mr. Begetty's nephew, and Emily, Mr. Begetty's niece. We have Steerforth and Tommy Traddles, David's friends at the boarding school. Mr. Wickfield, Mr. Ross's lawyer, and his daughter Agnes. Uriah Heep, Mr. Wickfield's clerk. Mr. Dick, a relative of Miss Trotwood. We have Mr. Micawber, the man whom David stayed with in London. Dora Spenlow, David's first wife. We have also Mr. Creakle, the headmaster of the boarding school, and Mr. Mill, who works at the same school. Now we will go through the characters in details. David Copperfield. David Copperfield, the hero and the narrator of the novel. David is innocent, trusting, and naive, even though he suffers a lot in his life. He suffers from his stepfather, he suffers from the headmaster, Mr. Creakle, and he is still an idealistic and impulsive, and remains honest and loving all through the novel. We have Agnes Wickfield. Agnes Wickfield, David's true love and second wife. As we said, Agnes is the daughter of Mr. Wickfield. Calm and gentle, Agnes admires her father and David a lot. Little Emily. Little Emily is Begetty's unfaithful niece. Sweet girl, but coy and vain. Her desire to be a lady caused her to disgrace her family and herself by running away from her family. As we will see, Emily ran away with Steerforth, David's friend. We have Clara Begetty. Clara Begetty is David's nanny and caretaker. Begetty is so nice, kind, and gentle, opening herself and her family to David whenever he is in need. Begetty stays faithful to David and his family all her life. Miss Betsy Trotwood, David's aunt. A very strange character and hot-tempered, although Miss Trotwood was kind. Miss Trotwood helped David when he came for help, educated him until he was able to support himself. Miss Trotwood also helped the Micawbers and offered them money. We have also Dora Spenlow. Dora is David's first wife, the daughter of Mr. Spenlow, the lawyer where David was training to be a lawyer, a very beautiful girl, but was very passive and weak in character, like David's mother. Learning cooking gave her a headache. Dora was empty-headed, spoiled and careless, yet Dora loved David. Dora asked Agnes on her deathbed to take care of David and marry him. Tommy Traddles, young David's simple and good schoolmate. Traddles works hard but faces a lot of problems in his life because of his lack of money. When he grew up, he met David again and became very close. Clara Copperfield, David's mother, kind, generous, and good. But Miss Copperfield was so weak and passive, couldn't stand up to her husband, Mr. Murdstone, couldn't defend her own son, left everything to him and to his sister, Miss Murdstone. We have Mr. Edward Murdstone and Miss Jane Murdstone. Miss Edward, Mr. Murdstone, the cruel second husband of David's mother. Both were cruel and evil. Mr. Murdstone showed David's mother false emotion to marry her, and he became very cruel to her and her only son. He and his sister sent David to a boarding school, and they made David feel unwelcome in his own house. One day, Mr. Murdstone beat David so hard that he almost killed him. David bit his hand trying to defend himself. He also forbade David's mother from showing any kind of love or kindness to David. And after David's mother died, he sent David to work in London. Ham Begetty. Ham is a simple, warm-hearted man. He is Mr. Begetty's nephew. He has lived with his uncle since his father died at sea. Ham loves his cousin Emily with all his heart, but unluckily, Emily betrayed him and ran away with Steerforth, David's friend. We have Uriah Heep. He is very evil, humble, flame-haired. He is Mr. Wickfield's slippery, scheming clerk. He was very poor, and he lived alone with his mother. He was very cunning. He used twisted means to get to his aims. He destroyed Trotwood, was very rude, and dared to offer help to Trotwood, although he was the one behind her financial ruin. James Steerforth. Steerforth, David's school friend. He was the oldest boy at Salem House. He came from a noble family. He was feared by other students. He had a great power over others and had a great power over David himself. He was responsible for firing Mr. Mill. He broke the heart of a girl called Rosa as he left her and hit her with a knife. He was immoral. He ran away with Emily and didn't marry her. We have also Dan Begetty, or Daniel Begetty. Begetty's brother is a happy, generous, and kind man. He took care of Emily and Ham. He also welcomed David into his eccentric little family's home in a boat on Yarmouth Sound. Now with the summary. David had a difficult life from the beginning. His father died before he was born, so he lived with Begetty and his mother. His great aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, refused to be his godmother, as Miss Betsy wanted a girl, not a boy. His mother, Clara, was very young when he was born. Clara loved her son, but Clara wasn't a strong character, couldn't stand up to her second husband, who was abusive to young David. Clara was overpowered by the cruelty of Mr. Murdstone. When David was a very young boy, he went to stay a fortnight with his nurse in Yarmouth. He had a wonderful time and played with a little girl called Emily. Emily was the niece of Begetty's brother. They all lived in an old boat that had been made into a house, together with Mr. Begetty's nephew Ham. Ham was a huge, strong man and happily carried young David around on his shoulders. On their return home, David found out that his mother had married a man called Mr. Murdstone. Mr. Murdstone was now David's new father. Mr. Murdstone's sister went to live with them and helped David's mother run the house. And Miss Murdstone did everything in the house. David's mother sat by the fire all the day, looking pretty. David was very unhappy living with his mother and his stepfather. He wasn't allowed to play with his friends, didn't even go to school. He was educated at home and led a very lonely and sad life. Mr. Murdstone was a very unkind man. He hit David with a cane. Once, after a beating, David bit his stepfather's hand. Mr. Murdstone hit David and kept him prisoner in his room for 5 days. Not long after that, Miss Murdstone sent David off to a school in London, a boarding school. When David arrived at school, he was the only boy there, as Mr. Murdstone had sent him to school during the holidays as a kind of punishment for his bad behavior. Mr. Creakle, the headmaster, was also away from the school, but Mr. Creakle was a very cruel man. He enjoyed hitting boys and marking them. The school was dirty and depressing. David had to wear a sign on his bag that said, "Beware, he bites," because Mr. Murdstone had told the school of the incident when young David had bit Mr. Murdstone's hand. David was lonely and homesick. Not only did he take lessons with Mr. Mel, but he also ate with him. The first boy back at school was Tommy Traddles. He made fun of the sign on David's back, but made young Copperfield's life easier by introducing him to the rest of the boys. Then David met Steerforth. Steerforth was a good-looking boy and an excellent student. He had a great power over David. He helped him a lot and protected him, but he couldn't protect him from Mr. Creakle. Steerforth didn't like Mr. Mel and was very rude to him. He made fun of him and caused Mr. Mel to be fired from school. David felt that he had lost a very good friend. One day, David had visitors. He thought that his mom and Mr. Murdstone came to visit him at school, but in fact it was Mr. Begetty and his nephew Ham. On seeing David with visitors, Steerforth went and introduced himself to them. David promised to take Steerforth with him when he next traveled to Yarmouth during the holidays. David was delighted when the holidays arrived. He was collected by Mr. Barkis, who told him that he was willing to marry Begetty. But when he came home, he saw his mother was sitting by the fire with a baby in her arms. David didn't know that he had a baby brother and was very upset that nobody had told him. David was welcomed by his mother and by his nurse, Begetty. The first morning back at home, David was afraid of seeing his stepfather and Miss Murdstone, who made it very clear that she didn't want David home for the holidays. David was very uncomfortable in his home and seemed to upset everyone except Begetty. He wasn't allowed to read or to play. Miss Murdstone was delighted when the holiday was over. David himself was happy to return to school and looked forward to seeing Steerforth and Traddles. And that was a summary of the chapters 1 to 5. Now we will discuss the main themes in these chapters. Number 1, love. We'll talk about David's love to his mother and to Begetty. As we know, David's father died before he was born. He loved his mother greatly. He was jealous of anyone who tried to clear his emotions with her. He was deprived of his mother's love twice. When his mother got married to Mr. Murdstone, who treated David badly and convinced his mother that he was a bad boy who needed discipline. David was sent to a boarding school where he was humiliated and mistreated. He even couldn't see his mother before dying. We have also David's love to Begetty. David loved Begetty, who cared for him even before he was born. As we know, Begetty was the one who was against Mrs. Copperfield's marriage to Mr. Murdstone because it was very upsetting, or would be very upsetting to David. When Mrs. Copperfield was marrying, Begetty took David to spend 2 weeks with her family in Yarmouth. He was sad when he left her to the boarding school that his stepfather sent him to as a kind of punishment. He wrote letters to her all the time, telling her that Mr. Barkis is willing. He, in fact, was the one who brought Begetty and Mr. Barkis together. He even encouraged her to marry him for her happiness. In return, we can see that Clara Begetty loved David a lot and wasn't afraid to break the rules. When Mr. Stone looked David alone, Begetty visited him secretly and tried to support him. We can see also that while David was leaving to school, Begetty stopped the cart and gave David some cakes and a bag of money. Begetty sent him money to help him in his journey to find his aunt. And when Begetty married, Begetty asked David to stay with her and her husband, consider their house his. They even kept him a room in their house and kept writing letters to David to be in contact with him all the time. Begetty considered David as her own son. Another theme is appearance versus reality. It's clearly in the characters of Mr. Murdstone and Miss Murdstone. The Murdstone were evil, cruel. Mr. Murdstone deceived and convinced David's mother to marry him through untrue love. However, after they married, he turned into a beast. He became unkind and was rude to her and her son, David. He mistreated David and beat him a lot. He also humiliated him and turned his mother's heart against him and tried to prove that David was a wicked boy. He separated between David and his mother by sending him to a boarding school where he was humiliated and treated badly. And even after his mother's death, he stopped him from completing his education and sent him to work in a warehouse in London. Miss Murdstone made David feel unwelcome in his own home whenever he went there on holiday. Miss Murdstone took pleasure in seeing pain and tears in the poor boy's eyes. He was neglected and ignored in his own home. Okay, that's the end of part 1 of David Copperfield. Thanks a lot and good luck.